Can you be quiet and let the professionals speak?" The words hit like a jackhammer against silence, echoing through the makeshift meeting trailer parked in the middle of the dusty construction zone. The one who spoke was Brandon Steele, chief structural engineer of the massive Landmark West project, standing at the head of the blueprint table with a laser pointer in one hand and ego dripping from his voice. "We don't pay workers to think," he added, turning deliberately toward one man in particular, "just to follow orders." Every head in the room swiveled. The air grew heavier than the concrete bags stacked outside. The target of his words, Elijah Monroe, stood quietly at the back, dressed in a faded blue work jacket, boots scuffed with dry cement, hands calloused from weeks on-site labor. A few of the white-shirted engineers smirked. Others averted their gaze. No one spoke. Elijah didn't react, not right away. His throat tightened, not from fear, but from pressure. Pressure like the kind that builds beneath concrete before a slab cracks. All he had done was point out an issue, a quiet warning during the site review. The northeast corner of the foundation. If we don't reinforce against the natural slope, we'll get settlement issues within 6 months. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't challenged protocol. He had spoken with respect, clarity. But respect meant nothing to men like Brandon. Brandon scoffed. "Did you all hear that? We've got ourselves a foundation expert in a hard hat and steel toes. Maybe I should hand him my degree from Cornell. Or maybe we should start a new hiring program, engineers by field experience." Nervous chuckles rolled across the room like loose gravel, but no one laughed with sincerity. Most knew better. They had seen Elijah's precision on the ground, the way he read a blueprint like others read a novel. But fear made people quiet, and Brandon fed on silence like a vulture feeds on stillness. Elijah didn't flinch. He gently closed the blueprint he had been holding, folded it with exactness, and placed it on the table. His eyes met Brandon's, not with defiance, but with something deeper, a quiet certainty. That stare unsettled Brandon more than any argument. He took a step forward, holding the pointer like a ruler about to strike. "This is why we have chains of command," he said, voice louder now. "People like me make decisions. People like you follow. That's how we avoid chaos." But no one in that room realized the chaos had already begun. It started not with shouting, but with a single movement. Elijah slipped his hand into his pocket, pulling out a phone most hadn't seen in years, a beat-up Nokia 3310. No apps, no biometrics, just a keypad and a mission. He typed 11 characters, KT3P15, call back, and hit send. A few seconds later, Brandon clapped his hands twice, mockingly. "Well, thank you, Engineer Monroe, for your passionate concern. Now let's all return to reality. The construction timeline won't wait for personal feelings." The meeting resumed, or at least pretended to. Brandon resumed his animated breakdown of cost-saving adjustments and concrete curing timetables, waving his pointer like a conductor. Some of the junior staff nodded along, eyes locked to the screen in self-defense. Others stared blankly, no longer hearing the words, but sensing a shift. Something invisible had moved. Because outside that trailer, in the dust-choked morning sun, a chain of silent gears had just begun to turn. Elijah Monroe was not who they thought he was. He wasn't just a middle-aged black laborer with cement on his boots and quiet eyes. His silence wasn't submission, it was calculation. Every morning for the last 6 weeks, Elijah had shown up in the workers' lot in a second-hand Toyota Corolla. He ate lunch on overturned pallets, carried drywall and poured gravel, joked with the warehouse crew, listened more than he spoke. But behind that rough exterior was a man whose name sat on every contract that held this billion-dollar structure together. Elijah Thomas Monroe, founder and CEO of Monroe Landmark Developments, a former site worker turned industry legend, a man who had built his company from the trenches, not from business school lecture halls, a man who believed the only way to protect the soul of his company was to walk among those who built it and see how they were treated when no one was watching. And what he had witnessed in that meeting wasn't just arrogance, it was a sickness, a structural flaw, like the foundation Brandon was so eager to ignore. Back in the trailer, Brandon moved to the final slide of his presentation, concluding with a smug nod. Any questions? The room stayed quiet, not because there were no questions, but because no one wanted to be the next target. Elijah gave a slight nod to Daniel Knox, one of the older engineers, then turned and walked out, his steps steady, unhurried. The sun cast shadows across the concrete walkway as his boots thudded softly, less like retreat, more like preparation. Brandon sat down, still basking in his own performance. He leaned toward his assistant, Nate Collins. You see, that's the problem these days. These guys read a few specs, suddenly think they're structural experts. They forget their place. Nate forced a smile, but his fingers trembled slightly as he packed up his tablet. Because, somewhere deep down, he could sense it. That wasn't the end. That man in the dusty coat wasn't just anyone, and that look, the calm one, wasn't defeat. 15 minutes later, as Brandon reached for his coffee and checked his phone, a message appeared that made his stomach twist. Chairman Monroe arriving on site. Unannounced inspection. All department leads to assemble. And just like that, the foundation Brandon thought he stood on began to crack. Brandon Steele never even got to sip the coffee. His hand froze midair as the notification lit up his screen like a flare over enemy territory. Chairman Elijah T. Monroe arriving for unscheduled inspection. All department leads to assemble in 15 minutes. The words pulsed like a siren, short, cold, authoritative. The message didn't come from, which meant one thing. This wasn't a routine walkthrough. This was the kind of visit that got people fired, or worse, exposed. Brandon's face drained of color. He lowered the coffee without tasting it. "Nate!" he barked, his voice sharp, frantic. "Get everyone moving. Prep the trailer. Reorganize the client display area. Make sure every set of drawings on the board is the approved version. And clean that damn whiteboard. I want it spotless." Nate blinked. All of it in 15 minutes? "You want to explain to Monroe why this trailer looks like a lunchroom?" Brandon snapped. "Move." Across the site, a ripple turned into a tremor. Word spread fast. The chairman was coming. The chairman, a name spoken in awe, but rarely seen. Elijah Monroe was legend, builder, innovator, and enigma. Some had worked at Eaglestone for 5, 10, even 15 years and had never seen him in person. The last time he visited a site unannounced, a project director lost his job before lunchtime, and the new site manager had to restart foundation testing from scratch. No one knew what he looked like lately, but everyone knew he didn't show up unless something was broken. Or someone. What Brandon didn't know, what no one knew, was that Monroe was already on site. And he hadn't come in a black SUV with tinted windows and a retinue. He came in the same dusty silver sedan he'd been parking behind the shipping containers for 6 weeks. He stood behind the rear of his car now, the trunk open, calmly changing out of his work-worn jacket and boots. Underneath, wrapped in gray felt, sat a charcoal suit, a crisp white shirt, a pair of silver-rimmed glasses, and a dark leather briefcase. Everything placed with precision. His transformation wasn't rushed. It was methodical. A ritual he had practiced more than once. The shedding of disguise to reclaim what was his. He buttoned his cuffs, adjusted the collar, slipped the glasses onto the bridge of his nose, and looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror. No longer Elijah, the quiet worker with dust on his sleeves. Now, Elijah T. Monroe, founder, chairman, and the man no one dared cross. He closed the trunk gently, turned, and walked toward the main gate, like a man stepping onto a battlefield he had already won. Brandon stood outside the admin trailer, tie freshly straightened, shoes buffed to a mirrored polish, rehearsing the smile he'd used in every high-stakes investor meeting. It was the kind of smile to say, "I'm in control," without speaking a word. He didn't see the car pull up. He just heard the crunch of gravel under polished shoes. The first to appear was a tall man in a black suit. Security, clearly. But what stunned Brandon was who stepped out behind him. Not the aging corporate executive he expected. Not some suited bureaucrat with soft hands and an empty handshake. It was Elijah. Not the worker. Not the man from the blueprint discussion that morning, but the real Elijah, dressed with quiet authority, shoulders squared, eyes sharp like tempered steel. Brandon's lips parted slightly. His practiced greeting disintegrated into the dry air. "Excuse me," he stammered. "We were expecting Chairman Monroe." Elijah took one calm step forward, extended his hand with precision, and said, "Elijah Thomas Monroe. It's a pleasure to meet you again, Mr. Steele." Silence, so complete that even the wind paused to listen. Brandon's jaw worked like he wanted to speak, but the words got lost somewhere between disbelief and dread. The man he had humiliated this morning, the man he called just a worker, the man he dismissed as a background noise, that man was now standing before him. Not as a subordinate, but as the one person in the entire company who could end his career with a single nod. Elijah didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He handed over a business card, heavy stuffs, minimal print. Founder and CEO, Eaglestone Developments. Brandon took it like a man being handed his own sentence. From behind, a few engineers and managers had gathered, drawn by the strange tension. They saw the shift. Their eyes bounced between Brandon and Elijah, beginning to understand what was unfolding. What they thought was hierarchy had just inverted. The words hit like a dropped beam. Brandon looked smaller now. His shoulders sank. His voice, when he found it, was thinner. "Maybe we should go inside, prepare the review." Elijah nodded once. "In 15 minutes, I want every member of your engineering leadership present. Bring all the current foundation assessments and the last 3 months of material records." "Of course," Brandon said quickly. "We'll have it ready." As he turned to rush back inside, Elijah remained still, watching the team scatter like ants under sunlight. He wasn't angry. He was patient. This wasn't about revenge. It was about revelation. Because this inspection wasn't for protocol, it was for truth. And while Brandon scrambled to scrub down the trailer and patch up paperwork, he didn't know Elijah had already seen everything he needed to see. 6 weeks of silence. Every misplaced file, every edited report. And now? The reckoning was scheduled, and the countdown had begun. What Brandon didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Elijah Monroe didn't need the documents he asked for. He had already reviewed them, quietly and thoroughly, weeks before today. Every file, every foundation record, every red flag buried beneath administrative signatures and conveniently vanished reports. Today wasn't for gathering data. It was for laying foundations, in truth, in justice, and in consequence. Inside the operations trailer, Brandon moved like a man possessed. Drawings were reorganized, whiteboards wiped and redrawn, schedules polished, laptops opened and flipped with frantic fingers. Nate Collins hovered beside him, glancing nervously between the door and the ticking clock. 10 minutes, Nate said. Brandon nodded stiffly. His throat felt dry, but water wouldn't help. Not now. Not with the realization that the man he'd called just a worker would be seated at the head of the table in less than 15 minutes. Across the site, the senior engineers were being summoned. Daniel Knox, seasoned, measured, too smart to ever step into Brandon's way, walked in with quiet resignation. Calvin Reese followed, clipboard in hand, his eyes tired. A few of the younger staff shifted nervously in their seats, trying to read the temperature of the room. But there was no temperature. There was only pressure. Heavy, silent, thick. And then Elijah walked in. No announcement, no dramatic pause, just presence. He stepped through the trailer door and the room straightened. Not out of routine, but out of recognition. Not everyone knew him by face, but everyone felt it. That ripple of authority, earned, not imposed. His suit was clean but simple, his steps silent. Behind him walked Henry Dawson, the veteran site supervisor who had mixed cement with Elijah back in the early days. On the other side was Daniel Knox, who nodded to the room like someone who had just realized where loyalty truly belonged. Elijah didn't sit. Not yet. He walked to the front of the room, looked at the screen still displaying Brandon's optimized construction timeline, and turned it off with a single tap. Then he faced the team. "Good afternoon. I'm Elijah Monroe. I've spent the last 6 weeks on this site under the name Elijah, no badge, no title, no authority, because I wanted to see how this company truly runs. Not in boardrooms, but in booth." No one spoke. "I've watched, I've listened, and I've seen both excellence and failure, often in the same breath. Today is not a performance review, it's a reckoning." He reached into his briefcase, pulled out a folded blueprint, and laid it on the table. It was worn, marked with notes. The northeast corner was circled in red. "This is the original design, unmodified. You've all signed off on it." He looked at Brandon, whose hands gripped the armrest of his chair. "But this section," Elijah continued, "is under terrain pressure from the slope. Earlier today, I pointed that out. I was dismissed, mocked, because I wore the wrong jacket." He turned to Henry Dawson, who placed a printed side report on the table. "Foundation cracks, level 1, have begun to appear in this exact zone, confirmed this morning." A few heads dropped. No one was surprised, but no one had spoken earlier. Elijah turned to the others. "And the problem isn't the crack, it's the silence. The culture that lets arrogance override caution and rank override reason." Then he walked over to Brendan, face to face. "No anger, no shouting. You once said, 'We don't pay workers to think.' Let me ask you this, Mr. Steele. What do you pay for, exactly? Loyalty to timelines, manipulation of data, the illusion of control?" Brandon opened his mouth, but the words didn't come. Elijah raised a hand. "Not yet." He turned back to the group. "We found material substitutions in violation of code, compressed timelines with missing inspections, reports edited after submission, and every one of them signed by you." Henry opened another file. Nate Collins stepped back slightly, as if he didn't want to be seen near Brandon's shadow. Elijah placed the final nail gently. "The building you're constructing will stand for 30 years, maybe 50. People will work in it, sleep in it, trust it, and you gambled its foundation for a quarterly bonus." Brandon's face flushed red, then pale. His mouth twitched. I didn't do it for personal gain," he mumbled. "It was for the team. We needed to hit savings." "And how much does it cost?" Elijah asked. "To fix a life lost in a collapse?" Silence. Then a voice rose from the back. "I tried to say something," said Calvin Reese, stepping forward. "I filed a report. It got lost. I noted the cracks too," another added. "But when Brandon overrode it, I didn't push back. I didn't want to lose my job." Elijah nodded. "And that's the culture I came here to confront." He walked slowly back to the front, every step measured, then placed 2 sheets of paper on the table in front of Brandon. "You have 2 choices. 1, immediate termination with the company filing formal charges, or 2, you resign voluntarily, return your bonus, and spend 6 months teaching at our technical center for underprivileged youth. No title, no salary. Just rebuilding with your hands." The room froze. Brandon looked at the papers as if they were written in a language he no longer understood. Around him, no one spoke. No one defended him, because for the first time in years, Brandon Steele wasn't the voice at the front of the room. He was the echo of his own arrogance. But what no one expected was that Brandon wouldn't argue, wouldn't protest. He'd simply pick up the resignation form and walk out into a redemption path no one saw coming. Brandon Steele didn't say a word, not a protest, not an apology. He simply lowered his gaze, reached for the second paper, the resignation, and signed his name with a trembling hand. The room was silent, not out of satisfaction, but gravity. What had just unfolded wasn't a routine HR correction. It was a dismantling of a power structure that had stood unchallenged for too long. And as Brandon walked out, with his resignation form tucked beneath his arm like a folded blueprint, the foundation he once stood on continued to crack behind him. Outside, the yard had shifted from its usual rhythm. Word traveled faster than steel beams across scaffolding. A crowd had begun to gather by the main platform. Workers, engineers, subcontractors, foremen, even site support crews. Some had heard murmurs of what had just happened. Others didn't need to. They could feel it in the air, like the moment before thunder breaks. Nate Collins adjusted his earpiece, gave a subtle nod to Elijah. "They're ready, sir. Everyone's out there." Elijah stood still for a moment, eyes scanning the faces still seated around the conference trailer. Then he turned to Henry Dawson. "Let's go." When he stepped out into the open air, the reaction wasn't dramatic. No cheers, no clapping, just attention, sharp, focused, full. He walked to the makeshift stage, 2 steel frames stacked with plywood, and climbed up, standing with his hands clasped calmly behind his back. No microphone, no script, just one voice that had been silent for too long. "For those of you who don't know me," Elijah began, his tone measured. "My name is Elijah Thomas Monroe. I'm the founder and chairman of Monroe Landmark Developments. For the last 6 weeks, you've known me as Elijah, the guy in the blue jacket, the one mixing cement, pulling rebar, eating lunch behind the forklift lot. No titles, no privileges, just another set of hands." A few gasps swept through the crowd. Heads turned. Some stared in disbelief. Others exchanged looks of realization. It made sense now. The way Elijah had asked questions, the precision in his observations, the calm way he never reacted to disrespect. He wasn't hiding, he was watching. "I came here under cover," he continued, "because I wanted to see my company from the ground up. Not from quarterly reports or polished presentations, but from steel-toed boots and sunburnt faces. I wanted to hear what was said when no one thought the boss was listening." He paused, let the words settle like fresh concrete. "What I found," he said slowly, "was both troubling and inspiring. I saw teams who worked through heat waves, kept each other safe, solved problems on the fly. I saw laborers smarter than the designs they were given, and supervisors too afraid to listen. I saw silence. Silence from fear. Silence from being told, 'You don't have the title to speak.' That ends today." From the trailer, Brandon Steele watched through the window, his hand still gripping the edge of the desk, knuckles white. He didn't leave the site immediately. Not yet. He needed to hear it too. Even if it wasn't meant for him anymore. "Marcus Ellison," Elijah continued, deliberately using the old name for symbolic weight, "has resigned as chief engineer. Not because he was incompetent, but because he confused rank with righteousness. He stopped listening, and when leaders stop listening, structures fail." He looked out at the crowd. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "So here's what we're going to do. Starting next week, every employee, from site managers to part-time laborers, will have the right to report technical concerns directly to the Safety Oversight Board. No filter, no chain of command red tape. Every report will receive feedback within 48 hours. If you see a risk, you will be heard." The workers, most of whom had never spoken up in meetings, now stood taller. Rosa from the supply shed nodded slowly, hands still clutching her clipboard. Tyrell, the machinist who had once been mocked for correcting a pressure valve spec, crossed his arms, not in defiance, but in quiet pride. Luis, the youngest mason on site, blinked hard, not because he was tired, but because for the first time he felt seen. "And that's not all," Elijah said. "We are launching the Mentorship from the Ground initiative. If you have experience and insight, you can now be trained into a technical role. You'll learn from engineers and from people like Brandon Steele, who will spend the next 6 months teaching at our community center, not as punishment, but as part of his redemption." Gasps turned into murmurs. Eyes turned toward the trailer again. No one jeered. No one clapped. But the understanding was clear. The man who had stood above them had finally come down to rebuild. Not with commands, but with contribution. And for those wondering if second chances are real, Elijah added, look around you, you're standing on one. A hush fell over the yard. This company was never built on concrete alone. It was built on people who knew how to listen, who knew that just because your name's not on the drawing doesn't mean you don't see the flaw. Respect isn't given by title, it's earned by action. He stepped down from the platform, nodding to Henry as he did. There were no dramatic exits, no spotlight moments. Just one man, quietly walking back through the crowd like he had the first day, except now every step carried a different weight. But while Elijah returned to his office to set the new foundation in motion, another transformation was already beginning. Inside the classroom of a man the world thought had been broken for good. While Elijah returned to his office to begin rebuilding the company's foundation in policy and practice, a different kind of reconstruction had already started across town, far from concrete mixers and blueprints, inside a quiet classroom with no spotlight, no applause, and no prestige. It was here, in a modest room at the Woodrow Technical Training Center, that Brandon Steele, once chief engineer, now volunteer instructor, stood at the front of a whiteboard that had nothing to do with contracts or quarterly projections. The morning light filtered through dusty window panes. Students sat in mismatched chairs, young men and women from underserved communities, some still wearing their work boots, others gripping notebooks with fingers rough from labor. There were no titles here, no chain of command, only eyes looking forward, waiting to see if the man in front of them had something worth saying. Brandon adjusted his sleeves. He no longer wore tailored suits or monogram cufflinks, just a gray button-down shirt, khaki slacks, and a humble name tag that read, Mr. Steele, Field Instructor. His voice, once crisp with arrogance, now carried a measured weight. If the soil has a high clay content, he said, pointing to a soil test on the screen, and you skip reinforcement, even a perfect blueprint will betray you. Not because the design was flawed, but because you ignored the ground beneath it. The students listened, not out of duty, but curiosity. Brandon didn't just teach formulas. He told stories. Of mistakes made, corners cut, warnings ignored. Of a man who thought leadership meant being louder, who once signed off on a pour knowing the risk just to hit a metric. He never said his own name in those stories, but they knew. They always knew. One student, Jalen, a quick-thinking 18-year-old who worked weekends at a warehouse, raised his hand. What happens if you mess up and no one catches it? Brandon paused. It still cracks, he said. Eventually. Might be a year, might be 10, but one day, that wall will shift and the flaw will show itself. Later, during break, Brandon sat in the courtyard under a faded tree. He didn't scroll through a phone. He just watched the wind lift papers on the table, let the sun warm his face. It was quiet, and in that quiet, something new had taken root. Not redemption, not yet, but responsibility. Across the yard, Elijah Monroe stood watching. He hadn't announced his visit, just walked onto the campus the way he had 6 weeks earlier at the construction site, without a title, but with purpose. Gregory Knox stood beside him, arms folded, a quiet smirk on his lips. He stayed, Greg said, 6 months, no salary, never missed a day. Elijah nodded. He could have taken any of those job offers he got, didn't even interview, Greg added. Said there were a few students he wasn't ready to leave behind. Inside the classroom, Layla, one of the few female students in the cohort, just 17, her hands always inked from sketching, waited after class. Mr. Steele? She asked, voice small. You ever mess something up so bad you think no one will trust you again? Brandon looked at her. Not through her, at her. He knelt beside her desk. I did, he said, and I waited for someone to give me permission to try again. But no one did, so I gave it to myself. Layla looked down at her notebook. She'd been working on a beam stress calculation. She'd gotten the angle wrong, Brandon picked up her pencil. Try it this way. Think about where the weight wants to go, not just where you want it to. Layla nodded. She didn't smile, but she understood. As the weeks turned into months, Brandon kept showing up. He graded work at night, rebuilt old practice models, cleaned the supply room even when no one asked, not because he wanted recognition, but because for the first time in his life, he felt useful. Not because of what he knew, but because of how he'd changed. And then came the invitation. Elijah called him to the Eaglestone headquarters. It was the first time Brandon had returned since the day he resigned. The building hadn't changed much, but he had. He walked slower, noticed more, greeted people by name. When he stepped into Elijah's office, he didn't sit until he was told to. "I've had offers," Brandon said, placing a folder on the desk. Project coordinator in Austin, design consultant in Denver, even one in Geneva. Elijah didn't flinch. He waited. Brandon exhaled. "But I turned them down. I'm not ready to leave yet." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "There are a few students who still ask me questions I haven't answered right. Layla just started getting compression ratios. Jalen's got a shot at an apprenticeship. I need a little more time." Elijah leaned back, then reached into a drawer. He pulled out 2 documents. One was blank. The other was a formal invitation. Field technical mentor, permanent staff. "I'm not giving you this," Elijah said. "You've already earned it." "I'm just putting it in writing." Brandon stared at it, then signed without hesitation. Outside, as he left the office, his steps weren't heavier, they were grounded. And in the elevator for the first time in years, he looked at his reflection and didn't see the man he had been. He saw the one he was becoming. But as Brandon found his second chance in the classroom, Elijah was preparing something far greater. A system-wide reform that would change not just Eaglestone, but an entire industry built on silence. While Brandon Steele continued laying his personal foundation, one lesson at a time inside the classroom, Elijah Monroe was preparing to do the same, but on a much larger scale. Redemption on an individual level meant little if the system that allowed failure to grow remained untouched. And Elijah, as both a builder and a leader, understood what too many in the industry refuse to admit. If you don't reinforce at the root, the next collapse is just a matter of time. A week after Brandon's quiet return to Eaglestone, Elijah convened a meeting unlike any before. It wasn't in a stuffy boardroom behind glass walls. It was in the main training hall, converted from an old warehouse, where both suits and steel-toed boots could sit side by side. He invited everyone: project leads, design staff, logistics coordinators, site supervisors, and 24 workers from across active sites. Some came out of curiosity. Some came because they didn't dare decline. But all came with questions. Elijah stood alone, at the front. No podium, no flashy presentation, just a single roll of blueprint paper in his hand. He unrolled it across the central table. A blank grid with the company name at the top and no plans drawn in. "This," he said, tapping the paper, "is Eaglestone's future. And we're not building it with concrete and steel. We're building it with trust." He let the room settle. No one spoke. Phones were down, eyes locked on him. "I don't care if your name's on the permit or the payroll. I care if you see a problem and say something. I care if you have the courage to speak up, even when the person above you doesn't want to hear it." He turned to the side wall, where a single sentence had been painted days before in bold black letters. "We build with materials, but we rise with humility." There were a few nods, a few straightened backs. Elijah continued. "Today, I'm announcing the Voice from the Ground program. Effective immediately, every employee at Eaglestone, from apprentices to executives, has the right to submit a technical, ethical, or procedural concern directly to the Executive Safety Committee. No supervisor filter. No risk of retaliation. Submissions will receive a tracked response within 48 hours. If a suggestion leads to cost savings or improved safety, the person responsible will be compensated, equal to the design credit." The room was still, but something beneath the surface began to shift. Gregory Knox, seated in the second row, broke the silence. "So, anyone can be the whistleblower now?" Elijah turned to him. "No, everyone is the quality control now." A few others exchanged glances. This wasn't just policy, it was revolution. "But that's not all," Elijah added. "Today we begin mentorship from the ground, a new career pipeline. Skilled workers with field experience will be eligible for a technical mentorship track. You'll learn CAD, stress analysis, project sequencing, and you'll be taught by both licensed instructors and people like Brandon Steele. Because we don't just need fresh graduates. We need people who've mixed mortar and placed rebar to help lead the future." One of the workers near the back, a man named Rico who had worked on 6 Eagle Stone projects but had never set foot in the office building, raised his hand. "You serious? We could actually get certified? Promoted?" Elijah smiled slightly. "You've already proven you can hold a project up. Now we'll give you the tools to move it forward." Applause didn't erupt, not yet, but heads nodded, shoulders eased, and for the first time, people who had once been invisible to policy saw themselves written into the blueprint. In the weeks that followed, the changes didn't stay in theory. The first test came when a young field inspector named Marisol flagged a water runoff miscalculation on a mid-rise development. Previously, her note would have been filtered, delayed, or discarded. But under the new system, her submission was reviewed, elevated, and acted on. The adjustment saved the project $32,000, 0 cents in future repairs, and prevented what could have been a safety issue during winter freeze. She received full design credit and a check equal to the engineering team's reward. Word spread. By month 3, incident reports had dropped by 28%. Time between risk detection and action shortened by nearly half. Internal surveys showed a spike in field team morale, and for the first time in company history, suggestions were pouring in not just from engineers, but from welders, framers, warehouse clerks, even interns. Elijah kept his door open, literally. Anyone could walk in. Some came with ideas, others came with doubts. A few came just to say, "I never thought this place could change." Elijah always answered the same way, "Neither did I." Until someone proved me wrong. But not everyone celebrated. Some senior managers resigned quietly, preferring the comfort of hierarchy to the discomfort of accountability. Others tried to adapt, some successfully, some not. One even filed a complaint, claiming the program diluted authority. Elijah read it, marked it with a red pen. Leadership isn't threatened by input, it's strengthened by it. And then, as if the universe had a sense of timing, an invitation arrived. Elijah was asked to speak at the National Construction Ethics Summit in Chicago. He hadn't planned to go, but after some thought, he agreed. He wouldn't bring charts or awards. He'd bring one thing: a student from Woodrow, a girl named Layla, who once thought she didn't belong in engineering. But just as Elijah prepared to tell the world how Eaglestone was changing, a whisper emerged from another site. One that suggested this movement would soon face its greatest test yet. Not from within, but from those determined to keep the old structures intact. The quiet rebellion Elijah Monroe sparked had turned into a company-wide transformation, but its ripples were beginning to reach far beyond Eaglestone's gates. Industry insiders, skeptical competitors, and old guard executives watched closely, some hoping for the model to fail, others secretly wondering if, maybe, just maybe, it could work. And yet, the team at Eaglestone wasn't watching for critics. They were too busy building projects, building people, and building something most companies never dared to sketch: a culture of dignity. At the Woodrow Technical Center, 6 months had passed since Brandon Steele first stepped into that fated classroom as a man, with nothing but 2 choices and a weight on his back. Now he entered not with shame, but purpose. Students no longer saw him as the man who fell, they saw him as the man who got up. One morning during final exams, Layla Henderson walked up to his desk, paper in hand. "You told us once that everything has a load limit," she said, eyes steady. "What about people?" Brandon smiled, not the polished smile of his former boardroom self, but something real. "Same rule applies," he answered. "But unlike steel, people can rebuild." At that moment, across town, Elijah Monroe stood at the top floor of the newly completed Eaglestone Tower, 30 stories of glass and steel that shimmered like a polished blade under the morning sun. Yet it wasn't the structure that made him pause. It was the plaque recently installed in the lobby. "We build with materials, but we rise with humility." Below it was a photo, not of a CEO cutting a ribbon, but of a man in a dusty work jacket, pointing at a blueprint, while a young engineer listened intently. Elijah traced the edge of the plaque with his fingertips. His reflection stared back at him. Not the chairman, not the legend, but the laborer who still showed up at 6:45 a.m. to walk the site before anyone else did. The laborer who once got mocked for thinking, who once had to stay silent. Now, his silence had become policy. His patience had rewritten the rules. Later that week, at the National Construction Ethics Summit in Chicago, Elijah took the stage in front of hundreds of industry leaders, but he didn't stand alone. Layla Henderson stood beside him, eyes wide, notebook in hand, dressed in the same field boots she wore to class. "This," Elijah began, placing a hand on her shoulder, "is the future of construction. Not just smarter, but fairer. Not just safer, but more human." He didn't give a keynote about innovation. He told a story about a man named Marcus who thought he knew everything until he realized he hadn't learned how to listen. About a girl named Layla who thought she didn't belong until she saw herself reflected in the respect of others. About a man named Elijah who wore a name tag without a title so he could find out what his company truly stood on. And he ended with this: "A building may rise from blueprints, but a legacy is built when people at the bottom are no longer seen as beneath us." Applause rose, not out of politeness, but resonance. A few competitors still dismissed it as a phase, but others took notes. One by one, reform initiatives began appearing across firms nationwide. Whistleblower protections, field mentorships, equity-driven bonus systems. None were identical, but all had the same root: the acknowledgement that even the strongest steel bends under unchecked ego. Back at Eaglestone, the changes had become embedded in the everyday. Workers spoke freely in safety meetings. Interns gave presentations on structural risks. New hires were paired with both senior engineers and field veterans to understand not just how to build, but why it matters. Brandon Steele, now a full-time director of field education, had rewritten the core training manual with a new preface. Engineering isn't just solving problems. It's hearing the ones no one's brave enough to say out loud. One Friday afternoon, a group of high school interns gathered around Brandon during the tour. One of them, a quiet boy named Malik, raised his hand. "Mr. Brandon, do you think someone like me could build something that really lasts?" Brandon didn't answer right away. He picked up a small pebble from the corner of the job site and held it up. "You see this?" he said. "It's not in the plans, but if it's out of place during leveling, it'll shift the entire beam." And that's what your voice is. Small, but critical, and if placed right, unshakable. At the back of the site, Elijah watched with Greg Knox, arms folded, face unreadable. Greg leaned over and whispered, "Still think he was a mistake worth firing?" Elijah didn't respond. He just smiled softly. Not because Brandon was redeemed, but because others now had a blueprint for how to be. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the edge of the skyline and the windows of Eaglestone Tower caught fire in its reflection, Elijah stood alone at the rooftop garden. He looked out, not at the buildings, but at the spaces in between, the places where unseen hands had lifted steel, where overlooked voices had pointed out a flaw and were finally heard. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathed in the wind, and whispered, "Now we're building." If this story moved you, if you believe leadership means listening and that second chances can lay the strongest foundations, Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe. We share stories where justice isn't shouted, it's built, one voice at a time.